October 23rd, 1944. The world is holding its breath, waiting for the end. In the dark forests of Belgium, near the German frontier, the trees drip with a cold, persistent rain. The ground is a pulp of mud and pine needles. In waterlogged foxholes and reinforced bunkers dug into the earth of their own homeland, German soldiers wait. These are not the fresh-faced, arrogant troops of 1940. These are the survivors. They are hardened veterans, men who have been forged in the crucible of a world at war. They are the men who endured the frozen hell of the Russian steppe, who fought yard by yard out of Stalingrad. They are the men who tasted victory in the deserts of North Africa, and then learned the bitter price of defeat at El Alamein. They have faced the relentless, methodical professionalism of the British. They have witnessed the terrifying, almost suicidal fanaticism of the Soviet Red Army. They have survived the Allied air forces, the endless rain of bombs that has turned their cities to rubble and their supply lines to dust. They have seen the best and the worst that this war, the most brutal in human history, could offer. And now, they wait for yet another American unit to test their mettle. They are defending the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, a barrier of concrete, steel, and dragon's teeth that is Germany's last great hope. They have been fighting the Americans since the Normandy landings, and they have learned to read the signs. They have learned the American patterns. The Americans are masters of material. They possess an avalanche of artillery, an endless supply of tanks and trucks and food. They attack in daylight, relying on their air power and their big guns to smash a hole which their infantry then exploits. The Germans have learned to weather this storm. They dig in. They wait for the barrage to lift. And then, as the American infantry advances, they open up with the weapons they trust above all others. The MG-42 machine gun, the Hitler's buzzsaw, and the 88mm cannon. They have broken American attacks before. They have inflicted terrible casualties. They believe they can do it again. Something, however, feels different this time. The intelligence reports filtering through German headquarters speak of a new American division moving into the line opposite them. The 104th Infantry Division. Their shoulder patch, they are told, is a Timberwolf. The German officers read the reports, and some allow themselves a grim, confident smile. The 104th is green, fresh troops, shipped directly from the United States. They have never been tested in combat. They are, in the cynical parlance of the German Lanzer, virgins. They are probably farm boys from states the Germans have never heard of, factory workers from Detroit or Pittsburgh, men who have never seen real war, who have never heard a shot fired in anger. This, the German veterans believe, will be easy. Green troops make mistakes. They are clumsy. They are loud. They bunch up under fire. They panic when the machine guns open up. They are predictable. What these German soldiers, huddled in the cold Belgian mud, do not know is that the intelligence reports have missed the single most important fact. They do not know who commands these Timberwolves. They do not know that these farm boys are commanded by a man they will soon learn to fear. A man whose very name will become a warning, a curse, whispered among Wehrmacht troops in the darkness of the front line. He is a general so aggressive, so unconventional, so utterly, pathologically relentless, that his own high command, the American high command, had already fired him once, fired him in disgrace, at the very pinnacle of his success. His name is Terry de la Mesa Allen. The Americans, the ones who loved him and the ones who hated him, call him Terrible Terry. And he is about to teach the German army a lesson in fear, a lesson they will never forget. The story of how this happened, how one American general became the living nightmare of German forces across 2 continents, is not a simple story of military tactics or battlefield victories. It is not about neat lines on a map or the predictable logic of strategy. It is a story about a man who refused to follow the rules, especially when those rules got his soldiers killed. A man who drank too much, who cursed too freely, who cared more about winning battles than about wearing a clean uniform or saluting a superior officer. It is the story of a man who was publicly humiliated, relieved of his command, and sent home, only to return more dangerous, more focused, and more lethal than ever before. To understand why, On that cold October night in 1944, German soldiers were about to face an enemy they could not comprehend. We must go back. We must go back to where the legend of terrible Terry Allen began. He was born on April 1st, 1888. April Fool's Day. His birthplace was not a quiet civilian town. It was Fort Douglas, in the Utah Territory. He was born inside the sound of the bugle call. Terry Allen came from a military family, a lineage of service that stretched back generations. His father was Colonel Samuel Allen, a career army officer who had spent his entire adult life in uniform. He was a man of the post-Civil War Army, a man who moved from post to post across the raw, untamed American West. But the tradition of the sword ran even deeper on his mother's side. His maternal grandfather was Captain Carlos Alvarez de la Mesa. Captain de la Mesa had fought for the Union at Gettysburg, one of the most savage and decisive battles in American history. He did not serve in just any unit. He was an officer with Company C of the 39th New York Volunteer Infantry. They were known as the Garibaldi Guard. The unit was composed largely of Italian, Spanish, German, and French immigrants. Men who had fled tyranny in Europe seeking freedom in America, and who, just a few years later, found themselves fighting to preserve that freedom for others. On July 2nd, 1863, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Captain de la Mesa found himself in the vortex of the fighting. He was in the inferno of the peach orchard and the wheat field, where thousands of men fell in a few desperate hours of combat. He was wounded, but he survived. He continued to serve until the war was won. This heritage service, sacrifice, a willingness to stand in the bloodiest ground, ran through Terry Allen's veins. Military service was not just a career in the Allen family. It was blood. It was destiny. It was the family business, passed down from the Civil War, through the Indian Wars, to whatever conflicts the new 20th century would bring. Young Terry grew up on a series of military posts scattered across the American frontier. This was the Old Army. The army of the horse. He learned to ride before he could properly read. He learned to shoot a rifle before he mastered arithmetic. He was a child of the cavalry, an army that still believed wars would be won by men on horseback, charging with saber and pistol across open fields. This upbringing would shape everything about him, for better and for worse. It gave him an instinct for action, a physical toughness, and a deep paternalistic bond with the common soldier. It also gave him a deep-seated suspicion of rules, regulations, and the abstract world of the classroom. In 1907, Terry Allen received the honor that every military family dreamed of for their son, an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Here was his chance to follow in his father's footsteps, to be anointed in the grandest tradition of the American officer corps. He failed. He failed spectacularly. Terry Allen despised West Point. He hated the endless hours of mathematics. He hated the rigid, suffocating discipline for its own sake. He hated sitting still. He was a man built for motion, and the academy was built to make men sit still, follow orders, and memorize textbooks. He stuttered in class, not from fear, but from a restless impatience. He piled up demerits for minor, almost trivial, infractions. His classmates, seeing this boundless, frustrated energy, gave him a nickname, Tear Around the Mess Hall Allen. In 1911 he was dismissed. He had failed mathematics earlier and been held back. Now, he failed ordnance and gunnery. The shame was immense. For most men, failing at West Point would have been the end of any military aspiration. But Terry Allen was stubborn. He possessed a fundamental bedrock refusal to accept defeat. If the traditional path, the front door, would not work, he would find another way. He enrolled at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He studied. He worked. He forced himself to do the one thing he hated: sit still. In 1912, he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree, and on November 30th, 1912, through sheer, unadulterated determination, he received his commission as a second lieutenant in the cavalry of the United States Army. He had made it, not through the prestigious front gate of West Point, but through the back door. This pattern, this refusal to quit, this willingness to find an unconventional path when the official one was blocked, would come to define his entire life. He was immediately in his element. As a cavalry officer on the Mexican border in 1913, the army was still chasing rustlers and bandits. One day, Lieutenant Allen led a patrol of just 6 soldiers against a band of 30 Mexican cattle rustlers who had crossed into American territory. Military doctrine, the West Point solution, was clear. Observe, report, and wait for reinforcements. Allen attacked. He charged. He and his 6 men captured or killed all 30 rustlers. This was not the action of a careful, by-the-book officer. This was the action of a man who saw what needed to be done and did it. Consequences be damned. Then, the world exploded. In 1914, the Great War began in Europe. America watched from the sidelines. Allen, like many young, ambitious officers, was terrified of one thing: that the war would end before he could get into the fight, before he could prove himself in real combat. When the United States finally entered the war in 1917 and Allen shipped out to France in 1918, he was not leading a cavalry charge. He was assigned to the 315th Ammunition Train, attached to the 90th Division. He was hauling artillery shells to the front lines. It was not glamorous. It was not what he wanted. But he was there. And that was what mattered. Eventually, Allen got his chance. He was given what he craved: command of infantry in combat. He was assigned to lead the 3rd Battalion of the 358th Infantry Regiment, 90th Division. He led his men into the bloody offensives at Street Mihiel in September 1918, and later into the meat grinder of the Meuse-Argonne, the largest and deadliest battle in American military history. It was here, in the mud and the blood and the splintered forests of the Western Front, that Allen developed his signature tactical innovation, an idea born from watching men die: night attacks. Standard military doctrine, the doctrine taught at West Point and every other military academy in the world, avoided night operations. They were too confusing. The risk of friendly fire was too high. It was too easy for units to get lost in the darkness, to stumble into their own wire, or to be cut off and destroyed. The standard, accepted wisdom was to defend at night, dig in, and wait for daylight. Attacks were for the day, when commanders could see the enemy, coordinate their units, and bring their artillery to bear. Allen saw something different. He looked at the casualty lists. He noticed, with the cold arithmetic of a man who has to write letters to mothers, that night attacks, when properly planned and executed, resulted in fewer casualties. Daylight attacks, against prepared positions, against trenches and machine guns and registered artillery, were horrific. They were organized suicide. Machine guns could see their targets clearly. Artillery observers on high ground could adjust fire precisely. Defenders had clear, interlocking fields of fire. But at night, all those advantages disappeared. The element of surprise, Allen realized, saved lives. The very confusion that made other commanders nervous actually worked in favor of the attacker. The defenders could not see what was coming. They could not coordinate an effective, coherent response. Their artillery fired blindly into the dark, often hitting nothing but empty fields. And most importantly, the defenders were terrified. They fired at shadows. They fired at sounds. They wasted ammunition. They broke under the intense psychological pressure of an enemy they could not see, an enemy that could be anywhere. Allen began to develop specific techniques. He drilled his men relentlessly. First, careful, detailed reconnaissance in daylight. His patrols would crawl to the edge of the enemy wire, memorizing every landmark, every trench, every machine gun nest. Second, detailed briefings. Every single soldier, down to the last private, knew exactly what to do, what the objective was, and where the rally points were. Third, simple plans. Complexity, Allen taught, was the enemy of night operations. The plan had to be simple enough to be executed in complete darkness, under fire, by men who were exhausted and scared. Fourth, prearranged signals, whistles, flares, simple codes. Fifth, designated assembly areas for reorganization. After the assault, the men knew where to go to consolidate their gains and prepare for the inevitable counterattack. He taught his subordinates to move silently until discovered, then, and only then, to hit hard and fast with grenade and bayonet. On October 24, 1918, during an attack, Terry Allen was shot in the face with machine gun fire. The bullet or shrapnel tore through his cheek and jaw. He was tagged for medical evacuation. He was, by any reasonable standard, out of the war. Allen persuaded the doctors to patch him up and return him quickly to duty. He stayed with his men. He kept fighting. This was not bravado. This was leadership. His soldiers, hunkered down in their foxholes, saw their commander, blood streaming down his face, his jaw wired shut, refusing to leave them. What message did that send? It sent the message: we are in this together. I will not abandon you. Follow me. For his actions, Allen was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He also received 2 Purple Hearts for his wounds. The war ended on November 11th, 1918. Allen returned to the United States with a hard-won reputation as a brave, innovative, and capable combat leader. But now came the hard part: 20 years of peacetime army life. The years between the 2 world wars were brutal for ambitious officers. The American Army, which had swelled to over 4 million men in 1918, shrank almost overnight. By the mid-1922, it numbered barely 130,000 men. An entire generation of officers found their careers frozen in amber. Promotions stopped almost completely. Men who had commanded battalions in combat, men who had been lieutenant colonels in France, found themselves reduced in rank, stuck as captains or majors for a decade, sometimes longer. Some resigned in frustration, seeking a better life in the civilian world. Others, broken by the boredom and the lack of purpose, drank themselves into obscurity. The best, like Allen, waited and prepared. Allen was no exception to the promotion freeze. He was a captain for years, but he made the most of those lean, frustrating years. He was, first and foremost, a cavalryman. In 1920, he competed in a 300-mile endurance horseback race through central Texas. It was a cowboy versus cavalryman competition, designed to test both horse and rider to their absolute limits. Allen completed the brutal ride in 101 hours and 56 minutes. He won the contest, proving he still had the iron endurance of his frontier cavalry days. That same year, he represented the United States as part of the Army equestrian team at the 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium. He won a bronze medal in polo. He was a horseman through and through, skilled in a form of warfare that was, before his very eyes, becoming obsolete. But Terry Allen was also watching the world change. He was not just a polo player. He was a student. He studied military history obsessively. He read everything he could find about the First World War, analyzing what had worked and, more importantly, what had failed. He studied the German army, their tactics, their organization, their emerging doctrine. He followed the revolutionary developments in tank warfare being pioneered by men like Guderian in Germany and de Gaulle in France. He studied aviation and radio communications. He understood, in a way many of his old army colleagues did not, that the next war would be different. It would be a war of machines. Horses would not matter. Mobility, firepower, and the seamless coordination of combined arms, tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft would decide the battles of the future. Most importantly, Allen never stopped training his men. Whether he was commanding a small training unit or stuck in a mind-numbing staff position, he pushed for realistic field exercises. He pushed for aggressive tactics. He pushed for high standards. While other officers marked time on their calendars and counted the years until retirement, Terry Allen prepared himself, and anyone he could influence, for the war he knew, with absolute certainty, was coming. Then, on October 1st, 1940, everything changed. General George C. Marshall, the new Army Chief of Staff, was rebuilding the American military from the ground up as war raged in Europe and Asia. Marshall had a rare gift. He was an immaculate organizer, a brilliant strategist, but his true genius was as a judge of character. He had an uncanny ability to spot talent, to see the fighter hiding inside the peacetime officer. He looked at Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen, a man in his 50s who was still, after all these years, a lieutenant colonel. And he saw something others had missed. Marshall promoted Terry Allen directly from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. He skipped the rank of colonel entirely. This was almost unheard of. It was a shocking jump, a signal to the entire army. Marshall insisted on the promotion, despite opposition from subordinates who pointed to Allen's record. They said he was too rough, too unconventional, undisciplined. Marshall saw what mattered. Allen could lead men in combat. He could make them fight. Everything else was secondary. In May 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Allen received the command that would define his career. He was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the oldest and proudest division in the American Army. General Marshall himself described Allen in a memo as outstanding as a leader who can do anything with men and officers. Terry Allen was about to prove Marshall right. On November 8, 1942, the 1st Infantry Division, with Terry Allen at its head, landed at Oran, Algeria, as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. This was the first major American offensive operation in the European African theatre. This was the debut of the American Army against the Axis. Allen led from the front, as he always would. The division took 418 casualties in the initial landing against the Vichy French, including 94 killed in action, 73 seriously wounded, 178 slightly wounded, and 75 missing. They secured their objectives. The Americans were in the fight, but the real test came in Tunisia. The campaign in North Africa was brutal. The Germans, under the command of men like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, were experienced, professional, and confident desert fighters. They had been winning battles against the British since 1941. The Americans were new to this kind of warfare. They were learning, and the lessons were being paid for in blood. In February 1943, German forces launched a massive, devastating counteroffensive at a place called Kasserine Pass. American units, many of them inexperienced and led by mediocre commanders, broke, and they ran. It was a disaster. It was a humiliation. German tanks, the feared Panzers, smashed through defensive positions. American equipment tanks, artillery, trucks, was captured or abandoned. Entire battalions disintegrated, retreating in confusion and panic. The Germans nearly split the Allied forces in two. For the first time, American soldiers were tasting real, comprehensive defeat at the hands of an expert enemy. In the midst of this chaos, Terry Allen and his 1st Division were thrown in to plug the gap. On February 21st, Allen, along with General Paul Robinet of the 1st Armoured Division, led a strong, decisive counterattack at Jebel al-Hamra. Allen was not in some rear area command post. He was at the front, personally directing artillery fire, positioning his infantry to stop the German and Italian advance. His troops captured 400 prisoners. They stabilized the line. The disaster was contained. A critical lesson was learned. American forces could stand and fight against veteran German units, but only with the right leadership, only with the right tactics. Then came El Guettar. In March 1943, this would become Terry Allen's defining battle in North Africa. The Germans, from the 10th Panzer Division, attacked Allen's division with a wave of tanks, intending to replicate their success at Kasserine. On March 21st, the battle began. Allen's division, dug in around the hills, fought for 21 straight days in what he later called the grueling Battle of El Guettar. Day after day, German tanks probed for weaknesses. Day after day, American infantry and, crucially, American anti-tank guns and artillery beat them back. The fighting was savage. Men fought in 100-degree heat with severely limited water. Artillery from both sides pounded the rocky landscape, turning it into a moonscape. Casualties mounted. On March 23rd, the crisis of the battle arrived. A powerful German tank column, supported by infantry, broke through the forward American positions. They were driving straight for Terry Allen's divisional headquarters. Staff officers, following standard procedure, suggested pulling the headquarters back to a safer position. It was the logical, tactical thing to do. Divisional headquarters were command and control centers, not frontline fighting positions. If the headquarters was captured or destroyed, the entire division could collapse. But Terry Allen understood something his staff did not. He understood the psychology of the soldier. His men, many of them still shaken by the memory of Kasserine, were watching. If the forward units saw the headquarters packing up and pulling back, they would assume the battle was lost. They would waver. Their morale, so painstakingly rebuilt, could collapse in an instant. Allen's response entered military legend. He looked at his staff officer and said, "I will like hell pull out, and I will shoot the first bastard who does." The headquarters stayed. Allen walked outside his command post and calmly watched the German tanks approach. His absolute, almost reckless calm steadied his staff. The forward units, seeing that the general himself was standing his ground, held their positions. American tank destroyers and artillery engaged the German armor at close range. The attack, which had come so close to succeeding, was repulsed. The line held. El Guettar was more than just another battle. It was the first major, unequivocal American defeat of experienced German tank units in World War II. The Germans had met an American commander who would not retreat, who would not panic, and who would keep fighting until they broke. Terry Allen had proven that his American troops, when properly led and trained, could beat the very best the Wehrmacht had to offer. In May 1943, the 1st Infantry Division, Allen's Big Red One, led the final triumphant drive on Tunis. Combat in North Africa ended on May 9th. 4 days later, on May 13th, nearly 250,000 Axis troops surrendered. The North Africa campaign was over. The Big Red One had taken 2,000 casualties in the final 17 days of fighting alone. Some of its companies were reduced to 50 men, but they had won. Now came Sicily. On July 10th, 1943, Allen led the 1st Infantry Division ashore at Guettar, Sicily, as part of Operation Husky. General George S. Patton, the 7th Army commander, and a man who understood aggressive commanders, had specifically requested Allen's division for Guettar. He correctly assessed it as the most difficult and dangerous landing zone. The beach was exposed. It was wide open to counterattack from multiple directions, and, more ominously, German and Italian forces, including armoured units, were positioned in the hills overlooking the landing areas. If any division could handle it, Patton believed, it was the Big Red One under Terry Allen. The landing went well initially, but the real test, as it always did, came the next day. On July 11th, German tanks from the elite Hermann Göring Panzer Division launched a furious counterattack aimed directly at the beach. If they reached the shore, they could split the beachhead in two, isolate the landing parties, and potentially drive the entire invasion force back into the sea. American infantry, caught in the open terrain behind the beaches, fought desperately to stop the armor. Artillery from ships offshore, U.S. Navy destroyers, fired over the heads of the American soldiers, their shells screaming inland to hit the advancing tanks. It was naval gunfire, combined with the fierce, stubborn resistance of Allen's infantry and supporting units, that finally stopped the German advance, just short of the beach. Omar Bradley, who was there observing the fight, later wrote in his memoirs, "I question whether any other United States division could have repelled that charge. The Big Red One had held. The beachhead was secure. The invasion of Sicily could continue. But the hardest fighting was still ahead. The Sicilian campaign became an ugly, grinding race between Patton's 7th Army and British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army to capture the key city of Messina. Both commanders wanted the glory. Both pushed their men relentlessly. Allen's 1st Division was given some of the toughest objectives, in the most difficult terrain. Then came Troina. Troina was a town perched on a mountain, controlling key roads through the rugged interior of Sicily. The Germans, masters of defense, had turned it into a fortress. From July 31st to August 6th, 1943, Allen's division attacked this stronghold. The fighting was brutal. It was house to house, rock to rock. Every building had to be cleared with grenades and bayonets. Every street was covered by German machine guns. American infantry attacked uphill, time and time again, into prepared, interlocking positions. The Germans did not just defend, they counterattacked. Again and again, as soon as the Americans took a piece of ground, German forces would launch a vicious, immediate attack to throw them back down the mountain. By the time the battle ended, the Germans had launched 24 separate counterattacks over 6 days of continuous, round-the-clock fighting. 24 times, Allen's men beat them back. The division's artillery fired thousands upon thousands of shells, turning the mountain into a smoking ruin. Infantry companies were reduced to half strength. Medics worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. But the Big Red One kept attacking. They kept pushing. They kept grinding down the German defenders. Troina finally fell on August 6th. The road to Messina was open, but the cost had been heavy. The 1st Infantry Division was, quite simply, shattered. The men had been in combat almost continuously since landing in North Africa 9 months earlier. They were exhausted. They needed rest. They needed replacements. They needed time to heal. On August 9th, 1943, Time magazine published its latest issue. On the cover, in full colour, was Major General Terry Allen. The article inside praised him as a great division commander in the making who was gaining a personal lustre. It celebrated his hard-won victories in Tunisia and Sicily. He was, at that moment, one of the most famous and successful generals in the United States Army. There was just one problem. On August 7th, 1943, 2 days before that magazine hit newsstands, General Omar Bradley, his corps commander, had relieved Terry Allen from command of the 1st Infantry Division. The reasons were complex, and they cut to the heart of the divide in the U.S. Army's leadership. On the surface, Bradley, a quiet, methodical, by-the-book general, believed that Allen and his assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, had let discipline slip. The Big Red One had become too good. It had become elite, confident, and, in Bradley's eyes, dangerously arrogant. They saw themselves as Allen's men first, and Army men second. They were notorious for their sloppy uniforms, their lack of military courtesy to officers from other units, and their general, piratical attitude. Bradley felt the division needed tightening up. Allen was replaced by Major General Clarence R. Hubner, a known disciplinarian. But there was another, deeper factor. Recent scholarship suggests the relief was pre-planned. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, and Patton had discussed it before the Sicily campaign even began. They believed Allen was the perfect man for the initial brutal phase of the war. He was the shock troop commander, the man you sent in to break down the door and win the desperate close-quarters fights. But they did not believe he was the right man for the long war ahead, the meticulous, organized continental campaign that would become the drive into Germany. Eisenhower himself later stated, "It is a terrible injustice to General Allen to hint that he was relieved for inefficiency." Bradley, in his own memoirs, admitted, "None excelled the unpredictable Terry Allen in the leadership of troops." But he added, "Neither Terry Allen nor Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. possessed the instincts of a good disciplinarian. The truth is that Terry Allen cared more about winning battles than maintaining parade ground standards. His men loved him for it. They would follow him into hell. The generals above him, the men building the massive systemic army that would invade Normandy, worried about it. So, at the absolute peak of his success, with his face on the cover of Time magazine, Terry Allen was unceremoniously fired. He was sent home in disgrace. For most officers, this would have been the end. A career-ending humiliation. Most would have retired in bitterness. Terry Allen asked for another chance. On October 15th, 1943, Major General Terry Allen, his rank restored, but his reputation damaged, took command of the 104th Infantry Division at Camp Adair, Oregon. The demotion from a premier combat command to a stateside training division stung, but Allen did not dwell on it. He had work to do. These were not the battle-hardened veterans of the Big Red One. These were green troops. They were draftees and volunteers, mostly factory workers and farm boys from the western states. Just as the Germans had suspected, their average age was in the early 20s. Most had never been far from home before the army. They knew nothing about combat. They knew nothing about killing or about dying. Terry Allen looked at these young men, and he saw potential, but potential meant nothing without proper training. He set out to create the most thoroughly, realistically, and brutally trained division in the entire United States Army, and he would do it by teaching them to master the one thing that most of the army feared, the one thing he had learned in the mud of the Meuse-Argonne. He would teach them to fight at night. While standard army training doctrine required 10 to 12 hours per week of tactical instruction, Allen drove his men through 30 to 35 hours per week, 3 times the normal requirement. Some weeks, his men trained nearly 6 hours a day on pure tactical problems, on top of all their normal military duties. The training was relentless, it was exhausting, and it was brutally realistic. Allen focused obsessively on night operations. He taught his men to move silently in total darkness. He drilled them in using compasses and terrain features when they could not see more than a few feet in front of their faces. He taught them to communicate without speaking, using hand signals, pre-arranged codes, and whistles. He taught them to coordinate complex attacks without radios, which could be intercepted, jammed, or simply fail in the chaos of battle. He taught them to trust their fellow soldiers completely, because at night you could not see who was beside you. You had to know they were there. The division practiced night attacks again, and again, and again. First, in small squad-level exercises. Then in company-level operations, then in full battalion-level attacks with live artillery support, all conducted in total pitch-black darkness. Allen insisted on realistic conditions. He used live ammunition. He used actual artillery barrages, forcing his men to hug the shells and advance as soon as the explosions moved forward. He used smoke to simulate the confusion of battle. His men learned that night fighting was terrifying, but they also learned that proper training, iron discipline, and simple, well-rehearsed plans could turn that terror into a weapon to be used against the enemy. The other divisions training at Camp Adair thought Allen was crazy. His men were exhausted, all the time. They stumbled through the dark Oregon forests at 3 o'clock in the morning. They practiced attacks in driving rain, in mud, in fog. But Allen knew exactly what he was doing. He was teaching them to survive. He knew from his own data, his own experience in 2 wars, that night attacks, when done correctly, resulted in fewer casualties than daylight assaults. The attackers had the gift of surprise. The defenders were confused, disoriented, and frightened. And most importantly, enemy artillery observers and machine gunners could not see their targets clearly enough to deliver effective, devastating fire. By the time the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, shipped out to Europe in the summer of 1944, they were the first and only American division trained specifically, methodically, and obsessively for nighttime combat. Omar Bradley, the man who fired him, would later admit that Allen brought the only division I know of that was prepared for night combat. That preparation would save countless lives in the battles to come. October 23, 1944. The Timberwolves entered combat near the German border in Belgium. The German veterans in the forest, the survivors of Russia and Africa, waited for easy pickings. The intelligence reports were clear. A green American division, fresh from the United States, never tested in battle. They had faced these units before. They knew the script. What they got instead was a nightmare. That first night, Terry Allen launched his division into action. The attacks came in total darkness. Timberwolf companies moved silently through the forests, navigating by compass and by memory of the terrain they had meticulously scouted in daylight. They hit German positions from unexpected directions, from the flank, from the rear. Sentries were eliminated silently, with knives or garrotes, before they could sound the alarm. German machine gun positions were overrun before the defenders were fully awake, before they understood what was happening. Forward observers, peering into the blackness, called frantically for artillery support. But they could not see the targets. They could not direct the fire effectively. German machine gun nests opened up, firing blindly into the dark, wasting thousands of rounds on shadows, on sounds, on their own profound fear. American infantry, Allen's farm boys, materialized out of the darkness like ghosts. They struck hard with grenades, automatic weapons, and bayonets. And then they vanished, melting back into the night, before German reinforcements could even be mobilized. Radio operators called for help, but by the time a counter-attack force was assembled, the Americans were gone. They were already miles away, hitting another position, rolling up another part of the line. By dawn, the German units were shaken. Entire platoons had been wiped out in the night. Positions that had seemed secure, even impregnable, in daylight were now death traps after dark. These were not green troops. These were trained killers. They fought like demons. They fought like they had been doing this for years. German unit commanders sent urgent, almost hysterical, reports up the chain of command. This new American division, it was different. It was dangerous. They owned the night. Over the next several months, this pattern repeated itself, over and over. The 104th crossed the Mark River on November 2nd, in a flawless night operation that caught the German defenders completely by surprise. They fought in the hell of the Aachen sector, starting November 16th. They were ordered to attack fortified positions that had held against other, more veteran Allied units for weeks. Allen's night tactics, his infiltration and bypass methods, cracked defences that bloody, costly daylight assaults could not break. When the Germans launched their massive, desperate Ardennes offensive in December, what history calls the Battle of the Bulge, Allen's division was on the northern shoulder of the breakthrough. They held their defensive positions from December 15th, 1944, to February 22nd, 1945. They absorbed the shock of the German attacks. They held critical road junctions. They refused to break. They helped prevent the German breakthrough from widening and threatening the Allied supply hub at Antwerp. Then, on February 23rd, after the bulge was contained, the Timberwolves crossed the Ruhr River and went back on the attack, driving deep into Germany itself. The reputation of the 104th spread like fire among German units. Wehrmacht soldiers who were rotated out of other, quieter fronts heard the warnings from the veterans they were replacing. Beware the Timberwolves. Beware the American division that attacks at night. Captured German reports after the war described the 104th as elite troops and night-fighting specialists. German defensive plans had to be changed. They had to account for the possibility of American attacks, not just at dawn, but at midnight, at 3 a.m. This forced them to maintain higher alert levels, 24 hours a day. It stretched their forces more thinly. It exhausted their men, who could never rest, who could never feel safe. This was psychological warfare, exactly as Allen had intended. An enemy that fears the night is an enemy that cannot sleep, cannot recover, and cannot fight effectively. The German propaganda broadcaster, Axis Sally, the American-born Rita Zucker, began making references to the American night fighters in her broadcasts from Rome, broadcasts that were monitored by Allied intelligence. She claimed, according to accounts later verified in Gerald Astor's biography of Allen, that this American night fighting was unfair. It was high praise, disguised as a complaint. When the enemy thinks your tactics are unfair, you are doing something right. On March 5th, 1945, the Timberwolves captured Cologne, one of Germany's great, ancient cities, now a vast landscape of rubble. On March 22nd, they crossed the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier, and drove into the heart of the German Reich. After the Rhine crossing, Allen's division went on a tear. They advanced 193 miles in just 9 days, ending at the city of Paderborn. Then they drove another 175 miles in 15 days, reaching the Mulde River. They were moving so fast the Germans could not establish a new defensive line. On April 11th, 1945, the 104th Infantry Division, alongside the 3rd Armoured Division, liberated the Nordhausen concentration camp in central Germany. What they found there would haunt these soldiers for the rest of their lives. Approximately 3,000 corpses lay scattered throughout the camp, piled in heaps, lying in the barracks, many in various stages of decomposition. They found 750 prisoners still alive. Barely. They were skeletal. They were diseased. They were too weak to stand. Many died in the days and weeks after liberation, despite the best efforts of American Army medics. Nordhausen had been a subcamp of the vast Dora-Mittelbau camp complex. Here, prisoners had been worked to death, starved to death, and beaten to death in vast underground factories, building V-2 rockets for the German war effort. The SS guards had abandoned the camp as the Allied forces approached, locking the gates and leaving the prisoners inside to die. Terry Allen's soldiers, men hardened by 7 straight months of continuous brutal combat, were sickened by what they saw. They had fought German soldiers in open battle. They had come to respect them as tough, professional opponents. But this was different. This was systematic, industrial-scale murder. This was an atrocity that defied comprehension. The men of the 104th realized, perhaps for the first time, that they had been fighting not just an enemy army, but an evil regime. Terry Allen, furious, ordered his men to photograph everything. He wanted documentation. He wanted proof, so that no one, ever, could deny what had happened here. He then ordered the German civilians from the nearby town of Nordhausen to be brought to the camp. They were forced to walk past the piles of bodies. They were forced to see what had been done in their name, just miles from their homes. Some Germans claimed ignorance. Allen did not care. They would see, they would know, and they would help bury the dead. From April 15th to April 19th, the division fought its last major battle, a 5-day struggle to capture the city of Halle, an important industrial centre. The fighting was house to house, street by street. German defenders, a mix of Wehrmacht, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm, fought stubbornly to hold every block. Artillery and tank fire smashed buildings. Infantry cleared rooms one at a time. During this operation, Allen encountered a fascinating figure from history, Count Felix von Luckner. Von Luckner had been a legendary German naval officer in the First World War. He was the captain of the commerce raider SMS Sea Adler, Sea Eagle, a sailing ship in disguise. He was known as the Sea Devil for his daring exploits, sinking Allied ships in the Pacific and Atlantic, often without a single loss of life. Now, he was an old man in his 60s, living in Halle, trying to save his city from total destruction. Von Luckner approached Allen under a flag of truce. He helped negotiate a partial surrender of the city, convincing the German defenders in his sector to lay down their arms. His intervention saved much of the historic city from being obliterated by American air attacks and artillery bombardments. Allen and von Luckner, old warriors from an earlier, almost chivalric conflict, dealt with each other with professional courtesy and mutual respect. They were from different countries, different generations, different wars, but they understood each other in a way that only combat veterans can. Later, in a gesture that recognized his courage in saving civilian lives, Count von Luckner was made an honorary colonel of the 104th Infantry Division on April 26, 1945, at Pretzsch on the Elbe River. Soldiers from a 104th Infantry Division patrol made contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The announcement was made simultaneously from Washington, London, and Moscow on April 27th. The Third Reich was cut in two. The war in Europe was, for all practical purposes, over. Allen's division, the Green 104th, had been in continuous combat for 200 days. Not one major objective assigned had failed. Not one attack had been beaten back. The Germans had learned to fear the night. In early 1945, after the capture of Cologne on March 5th, General Omar Bradley, now commander of the 12th Army Group, visited Terry Allen's headquarters. Bradley, the man who had fired Allen in disgrace in Sicily 18 months earlier, was impressed by what he saw. He had been reading the field reports. The 104th Infantry Division was performing magnificently. They had been in combat for less than 5 months. but they were already being compared to veteran divisions that had been fighting since North Africa. According to accounts verified in Bradley's own memoirs, he turned to Allen. "Terry," Bradley said, "I am pleasantly surprised to see these young Timberwolves of yours already ranked along with the 1st and the 9th as the finest assault divisions in the European theatre of operations. The 1st Division was Allen's old command, the Big Red One. The 9th Division was another elite unit, with a distinguished combat record. To be ranked alongside them, after such a short time in combat, was extraordinary praise. It was, from the stoic Bradley, an apology. Allen's response was pure, unadulterated Terry Allen. He looked Bradley square in the eye. "Brad," he said, "the 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company." It was not boastful. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute confidence of a commander who knew exactly what his division could do, because he had built it, piece by piece, from the ground up. Terry Allen had proven his point. The methods that got him fired in Sicily, the focus on aggressive, relentless combat over parade ground discipline, had produced another elite division. The training that other officers thought was excessive, even crazy, had created soldiers who could match any unit in the army. The man they said lacked discipline had built a division that won every single battle it fought. The recognition was sweet, but it could not erase what had happened in Sicily. Allen carried that dismissal with him, always. But he had answered his critics in the most effective way possible, by doing it all over again, with an entirely different division. He had shown that his success with the 1st Division was not a fluke. It was not the result of inheriting good troops. His methods worked. His training paid off. His leadership produced results. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Terry Allen had commanded 2 divisions through some of the hardest fighting of the Second World War. The 1st Infantry Division in North Africa and Sicily. The 104th Infantry Division across northwest Europe. Both divisions believed, with all their hearts, that they were the best division in the United States Army. Both were probably right, and both had been shaped, forged, and led by the same man. Consider what he accomplished. He took the 1st Infantry Division, already a proud unit, and turned it into the absolute spearhead of American offensives. He led them through the disaster at Kasserine and taught them how to beat German armour at El Guettar. He landed them at Gela, under fire, and held the beach against elite panzer counterattacks. He drove them up the mountain at Troina against 24 separate German counter-assaults. Every objective assigned, the Big Red One accomplished. Every battle fought, they won. Then, after being fired, he took the 104th Infantry Division Green Troops, farm boys with no combat experience, and in 1 year turned them into what Omar Bradley himself called one of the finest assault divisions in the European theatre. He trained them harder than any division in the army. He taught them to fight and win in the dark, when other divisions cowered in their foxholes. He led them through 200 days of continuous combat without a single major defeat. They crossed rivers under fire. They captured fortified cities. They advanced farther and faster than many veteran divisions. They liberated concentration camps. They linked up with the Soviet forces. And they did it all in 7 months. This was not luck. This was not inheriting good troops. This was leadership. This was training. This was a commander who understood, in his bones, how to turn civilians into soldiers and soldiers into winners. He did it twice, with 2 completely different divisions, under 2 completely different sets of circumstances. That is the mark of a truly great combat commander. Terry Allen retired from the United States Army on August 31st, 1946, with the rank of Major General. He had achieved everything a soldier could hope for. Except one thing. He had never received his 3rd star. He never made Lieutenant General. Perhaps that was the price of being too aggressive, too unconventional. Too much of a fighter, and not enough of a diplomat. The truth is that the very personality traits that made Allen a brilliant, beloved combat commander also made him difficult for the peacetime bureaucratic army to handle. He drank, not to excess in combat, but enough that it concerned his superiors. General George C. Marshall himself, his great proponent, had written to Allen during the war. "I must explain to you," Marshall wrote, that there had come to me from several different sources an indication that you had been drinking. I do not mean you were appearing under the influence of liquor, but I do mean drinking in the daytime. Marshall's letter is revealing. He did not relieve Allen. He did not punish him. He simply warned him and left him in command. Why? Because Marshall understood that in war, you need fighters, and sometimes fighters have rough edges. Allen's drinking never interfered with his combat performance. His tactical decisions were sound. His units won. Marshall was willing to overlook the drinking in the daytime because Allen delivered results where it mattered most. On the battlefield. But Bradley and Eisenhower, the great systems men, were building an establishment army for a long war and eventually for a long peace. They wanted commanders who fit a certain mold, disciplined, professional, conventional. Terry Allen was none of these things. He was effective. He was a winner. But he made the high command nervous, so they removed him from the 1st Division, hoping he would fade away. Instead, he came back with the 104th and proved them all wrong, all over again. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, the voice of the common soldier, who was later killed in the Pacific in April 1945, had written about Terry Allen earlier in the war. Pyle captured his essence perfectly. Major General Terry Allen was one of my favorite people. Pyle wrote, partly because he did not give a damn for hell or high water, partly because he was more colorful than most, and partly because he was the only general outside the air forces I could call by his first name. If there was one thing in the world Allen lived and breathed for, it was to fight. He had been shot up in the last war, and he seemed not the least averse to getting shot up again. His pattern for victory was simple. Just wade in and murder the hell out of the lowdown, good-for-nothing so-and-so. That was Terry Allen, direct, profane, relentless, and completely, utterly committed to his soldiers and to victory. After his retirement, Allen lived quietly in El Paso, Texas, near Fort Bliss, where his father had once served. He had given his whole life to the army. Now he could rest, but the peace would not last. The family tradition of service, the one that began with his grandfather at Gettysburg, would demand one final, terrible price. On October 17th, 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Terry de la Mesa Allen, Jr., was killed in action in Vietnam. He was commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, part of the 1st Infantry Division, his father's old division, the Big Red One. The battalion that Allen, Jr. led was the very same battalion his father had commanded decades earlier in World War I. The family tradition of service had come full circle. Allen, Jr. was leading his battalion on a search and destroy operation near Lai Khe when they were ambushed by 2 Viet Cong battalions in what became known as the Battle of Ong Than. The American battalion, approximately 500 men, walked into a perfectly prepared L-shaped ambush. Heavy machine gun fire and rocket-propelled grenades ripped into the American formation. The lead companies were decimated in the first minutes of the firefight. Lieutenant Colonel Allen, Jr. moved forward, toward the sound of the heaviest gunfire, trying to rally his men and organize a defense. He was hit multiple times, but continued directing his troops, continued trying to save his battalion, until he was killed. Between 58 and 64 American soldiers died in the ambush. It was one of the worst single-day losses for the U.S. Army in the war up to that point. Terry Allen, Jr. was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for his leadership under fire. The death of his son shattered Terry Allen, Sr. He was 79 years old. He was in declining health, but this blow was too much. His only son, following in his footsteps, had died leading men in combat, just as he had done for decades. The warrior's tradition, which had always seemed so noble, so right, now felt like a curse. His health, already declining, collapsed completely. He suffered a series of strokes. His heart weakened. He held on for nearly 2 years, but the will to fight, the relentless energy that had defined him, was finally gone. On September 12, 1969, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen died in El Paso at the age of 81. He was buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery next to his son, The old army cavalryman, the warrior who had fought in 2 world wars, the general who had led his men through the deserts of North Africa, the mountains of Sicily, and the dark forests of Germany, was finally at rest. Today, the United States Military Academy at West Point, the institution that dismissed him in 1911 for academic failure, presents the General Terry de la Mesa Allen Award to the cadet with the highest rating in military science. The academy that could not contain him as a student now honors his name. The failed cadet became one of the most successful and brilliant combat commanders in American history. Those German soldiers, waiting in the Belgian forests in October 1944, expected to face green American troops. They expected easy targets. Instead, they met Terry Allen's Timberwolves. Within days, German unit reports were describing a new, terrifying threat. An American division that fought like veterans from their very first day. An American division that attacked at night. An American division that would not stop coming. Wehrmacht intelligence officers warned other units. This division was dangerous. Their commander, they soon learned, was the same general who had led the 1st Infantry Division in North Africa and Sicily. Terrible Terry Allen had returned. By the war's end, the German veterans who had faced both of Allen's divisions understood what made him different. It was not cruelty. It was not even overwhelming firepower. It was training so intense, so realistic, that green troops fought like veterans. It was leadership so personal, so direct, that his soldiers would follow him anywhere. It was tactical innovation that turned the night from a time of rest into a time of terror. And it was, above all, an absolute, stubborn, and furious refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. Terry Allen never commanded armies. He never made lieutenant general. He was fired at the peak of his success and spent years proving he deserved another chance. But the soldiers who served under him, American and German alike, knew the truth. Terry Allen was one of the most effective, most relentless, and most successful combat commanders of the Second World War. He won every major battle he fought. He led 2 different divisions to glory, and he proved, beyond any doubt, that American soldiers, when properly trained and properly led, could beat the very best troops the enemy had. The Germans in those Belgian forests learned that lesson the hard way. The ones who survived spread the word. Terrible Terry was back, and the night belonged to him.